And now, boycott the Beijing Games. That's the focus of tonight's angle. The following are indisputable facts. China is a brutal dictatorship, a repressive regime. China does not recognize individual freedom, freedom to worship, speak freely, to petition the government. Fact, China has imprisoned and tortured political dissidents, Christians, and currently has more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps. So how does China keep its citizens in line? 1.3 billion. Well, through intimidation and fear, that's for sure, and a vast surveillance network. According to the BBC, by 2018, there were already about 200 million surveillance cameras in China. And by 2021, this number is expected to reach 560 million, roughly one for every 2.4 citizens. Now, peaceful protesters in Hong Kong, they tried their best to avoid being caught on surveillance cameras. They could bow down and kind of walk below them, but mask wearing was probably a bigger help than their camera dodging. And China's aggressive ambitions aren't limited to its own borders, of course, or to Asia. They want the entire world, with America being the crown jewel. Dominating America means defeating us economically. And to advance that goal, they're infiltrating American educational institutions. Now, one estimate puts the number of Chinese students studying in the United States at a staggering 350,000. And it's no exaggeration to say that our colleges and our universities have become infested with CCP agents. One recent example is the University of Texas professor who the feds accused of stealing proprietary technology from a U.S. tech startup and handing it over to the CCP-controlled Huawei. Late last year, DHS warned that Chinese-made drones were providing U.S. critical infrastructure and law enforcement data to the Chinese government. Well, now, what does the CCP want that data for? What do they plan to do with it? For its part, the EU, strapped for cash and desperate for funds to support its struggling economies, it doesn't seem to care that much about human rights in China.
The Chinese president spoke yesterday, and he and I agree on that. We see a need for multilateralism.
We need to find a new mode of cooperation between states, basically to go back to an efficient brand of multilateralism.
America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy. America is back, ready to lead the world.
Well, translation, appeasement is upon us. And it's funny, though, that they never seem to hesitate when it's time to criticize us, the voters, right? They have no problem criticizing people who believe in America first or anti-globalization. But China? No, they back away. How are they going to lead the world if it has to go hat in hand to an evil regime like China? That's not leading. That's giving in. Joe Biden claims that, America's back and he wants to be the world leader. Well, if that's really true, he should start by announcing a boycott of the 2022 Winter Games in Beijing, and then convince our allies in Europe and elsewhere to join the boycott. When the Olympic Committee let Hitler host the 1936 Games in Berlin, it was a dark stain on the Games that lasted for decades. It was just big propaganda, a coup for the Nazis. And it's going to be the exact same for the Chinese communists. Imagine President Xi walking into that stadium for the first time, lording over the crowd, packed in tight, to show that the decadent West, boy, you guys haven't overcome COVID, but we have, with his air of superiority. Now, if we're there, if the United States is there, the CCP will just argue that our complaints about human rights, they don't really mean anything. We just say that, we mouth the words. That we're just too weak to resist China. That we'll always do what we're told. And many observers around the world, I'm afraid, will agree. Now, in the past, we've had presidents who were brave enough to take on rogue regimes. Heck, if Jimmy Carter could stand up to the USSR in 1980, Biden can stand up to the CCP today. But I'm not holding my breath. For most of his career, old Joe has defended China from its critics. And he's still doing so.
The idea I'm not going to speak out against what he's doing in Hong Kong, what he's doing with the Uyghurs in western mountains of China, and Taiwan trying to end the one China policy by making it forceful. He gets it. Culturally, there are different norms at each country, and their leaders are expected to follow.
Just different cultural norms, that whole thing they're doing with the Uyghurs, but I'll mouth the words. You see what he did there? Now, of course, establishment figures such as Mitt Romney, well, they're pushing back on the idea of a boycott, claiming it would punish our athletes. Now, to be blunt, that's just pathetic. The angle, of course, empathizes with athletes. We love the athletes who participate in the games, and they've trained so hard to compete. And of course, the IOC, the problem is they never should have awarded the games to China in the first place. But rewarding China after its actions surrounding the virus and its gross human rights abuses, it's not an option. China is desperately seeking legitimacy on the world stage, and we should not give it to them. Now, of course, corporate America has no problem being associated with China. We know that from what Nike's done. This is a list of U.S. companies who are top-tier sponsors for the 2020 Games. It's a big one. Now, the Cato Institute's Doug Bandow also disagrees with the boycott as well. He argues that a solitary or almost solitary holdout by the U.S. might make some feel righteous, but it would likely be counterproductive. A unitary action would highlight America's isolation. Beijing would feel emboldened, more convinced that no one was prepared to confront even its worst behavior. Well, his arguments are kind of unpersuasive. The boycott would show the world that we're not going to treat China as a normal country any longer. Perhaps we couldn't convince, some of our allies to join the boycott, but they'd probably side with China no matter what we did. At least we wouldn't be selling out our own principles. Doesn't that count for something? The Biden administration has apparently not made, reportedly, a final decision on China. Again, that's what they claim. But regardless of what the U.S. government and the International Olympic Committee decide to do, we as consumers should all refuse to watch the games. The IOC gets an enormous amount of money for the U.S. TV rights, and we need to show NBC and the IOC that those rights will be worthless if they insist on acting as a CCP promoter or a legitimizer. Allowing China to become the world's most powerful country was a catastrophic failure of U.S. policymaking, with blame from everyone from George H.W. Bush to Joe Biden. But if we want to remain independent ourselves, we Americans are going to have to get used to the idea of sometimes being a lonely beacon for freedom in the world, a world dominated now by dictatorships and technocrats. The 2022 Olympics would be a good place to start.